In just 16 days in September 1941, 665,000 Soviet soldiers vanished into the largest military trap ever sprung. To understand the scale, imagine more human beings than the entire population of wartime Washington, D.C., surrounded, starved, and destroyed in a pocket of Ukrainian steppe smaller than Rhode Island. While these men fought and died, Hitler and his top generals waged a bitter battle of their own over whether this operational triumph had just lost them the war. The Battle of Kiev was not one story, but three converging into a single catastrophe. It was a tactical masterpiece that became a strategic disaster. It was Stalin's fatal paralysis meeting Hitler's ideological gamble. And it was the moment when military brilliance enabled genocidal horror, revealing what this war truly was. On August 21, 1941, Adolf Hitler issued an order that would define the entire Eastern campaign. He commanded the diversion of Army Group Center's panzer forces south toward Kiev, prioritizing the conquest of Ukraine over the direct assault on Moscow. Every senior general in the Wehrmacht opposed him. Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group and Germany's premier armored warfare expert, argued vehemently for continuing the advance on the Soviet capital. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, warned that diverting the panzers would lose the strategic initiative at the moment of maximum opportunity. Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, recorded his bitter opposition in his war diary. The professional military judgment was unanimous. Moscow was the center of Soviet power, the hub of the rail network, the political heart that Stalin would defend with everything he had. Take Moscow, and the war might end. Divert to Kiev, and the window would close. Hitler summoned Guderian to a personal meeting on August 23rd. The Panzer general arrived determined to change the Führer's mind. He laid out the operational case with precision. Army Group Center had driven to within 220 miles of Moscow after the victories at Minsk and Smolensk. Over 320,000 Soviet prisoners had been taken at Minsk in June and July. Another 300,000 had been captured at Smolensk in July. The Red Army in front of Moscow was reeling. The roads were open. Every day of delay allowed the Soviets to dig in, to bring up reserves, to prepare the defenses that would make the capital a fortress. Guderian argued that striking now, while the enemy was off balance, was the only path to victory before winter. Hitler listened, then he refused. The Führer's logic was not purely military, it was ideological and economic. Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe, the source of grain that would feed the Reich and starve the Soviets. The Donbass industrial region produced the coal and steel that powered Soviet war production. Capturing these resources was not a luxury. It was the foundation of Lebensraum, the living space that justified the entire invasion. Beyond economics lay another priority. Hitler wanted the destruction of Soviet forces, not merely their retreat. Encircling and annihilating the armies defending Kiev would eliminate the threat to Army Group South's northern flank and open the road to the Caucasus oil fields. The capital could wait. The resources and the Red Army could not. Guderian acquiesced. He had no choice. But his memoirs and war diaries record his lasting resentment. He believed the decision was a catastrophic mistake, and he was not alone. By August 1941, the strains on the German war machine were already visible to anyone willing to see them. Supply lines stretched over 1,000 kilometers from railheads in Poland to the front lines deep in Soviet territory. The roads were dirt tracks that turned to soup in rain. The infantry divisions lagged days behind the panzers, unable to keep pace or consolidate gains. Fuel shortages paralyzed entire units. Guderian's own reports from late July and early August mentioned vehicles abandoned for lack of spare parts, tanks breaking down faster than they could be repaired, and soldiers exhausted from 2 months of continuous offensive operations. The blitzkrieg that had crushed France in 6 weeks was grinding against the immensity of Russia and the resilience of an enemy that refused to collapse. The operational tempo that had seemed unstoppable in June was becoming unsustainable by August. Yet Hitler ordered the panzers south, and south they went. But while Hitler and his generals argued over maps in East Prussia, 800 kilometers to the south, another leader was making decisions that would doom over 500,000 of his own men. What was Stalin seeing that his field commanders were not? Semyon Budyonny commanded the Soviet southwestern direction, the theater-level command overseeing multiple fronts defending Ukraine. Mikhail Kirponos commanded the southwestern front, directly responsible for the defense of Kiev. Both men were experienced officers who understood operational reality. By late August, they could see the trap forming. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group was driving south from Army Group Center. Paul von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group was preparing to strike north from Army Group South's bridgehead at Kremenchug. The two panzer forces were converging on a single point, and the Soviet forces defending Kiev sat directly between them. The geometry was simple and fatal. If the pincers closed, over 500,000 Soviet soldiers would be encircled with their backs to the Dnieper River. Budyonny requested permission to withdraw. Stalin refused. On September 12th, with German tanks fewer than 50 kilometers from closing the ring, Kirponos sent an urgent message to Moscow. He described the situation in stark terms. The front was collapsing. German armored spearheads were racing through gaps in the Soviet lines. Continued defense of Kiev would result in the encirclement and destruction of the entire southwestern front. He requested immediate authorization to conduct a fighting withdrawal to the east, abandoning the city to save the army. Stalin's response was unequivocal: hold Kiev at all costs. On September 13th, Budyonny sent his own desperate plea. He warned of imminent catastrophe. He begged for operational flexibility. Stalin relieved Budyonny of command and replaced him with Semyon Timoshenko, but the order remained unchanged. Kiev must be held. The reason for Stalin's refusal was not military. It was psychological and ideological. The Soviet dictator had spent the 1930s purging the Red Army's officer corps, executing or imprisoning thousands of experienced commanders on suspicion of disloyalty. The survivors had learned a brutal lesson. Initiative was punished. Retreat was defeatism. Defeatism was treason. Treason meant death. Stalin's command style paralyzed decision-making at every level. Commanders waited for explicit orders rather than acting on their own judgment, because acting without orders could mean a bullet in the back of the head. Even when the situation demanded immediate withdrawal, no one dared order it without Stalin's personal authorization. And Stalin, isolated in Moscow and distrustful of his generals, refused to believe the reports of impending encirclement. He had convinced himself that the German drive south was a feint, that the real threat remained the advance on Moscow, and that abandoning Kiev would trigger a general collapse of the southern front. He was wrong on every count. On September 16th, the German pincers closed at the town of Lokvitsia, 150 kilometers east of Kiev. Guderian's tanks driving south met Kleist's tanks driving north. The trap was shut. The next day, September 17th, Stalin finally authorized withdrawal. The order came exactly 1 day too late. Kirponos received the message and immediately attempted to organize a breakout. It was impossible. German forces had already established a continuous encirclement line. Soviet units trying to escape ran into prepared defensive positions, minefields, and concentrated artillery fire. The roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles and fleeing soldiers. Command and control disintegrated. Kirponos himself was killed on September 20th during a desperate attempt to break through the German lines. One Soviet survivor later testified about those final days. "We waited for orders that never came. We knew we were surrounded, but Stalin's order was clear: hold at all costs." Many tried to break out in small groups, but only a handful escaped. The rest surrendered or died of starvation and wounds. The catastrophe was complete. As Stalin's refusal sealed the fate of his armies, two massive steel pincers were already racing toward each other across the Ukrainian steppe. How did the Germans execute the largest encirclement maneuver in military history? Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group began its southward drive in late August from positions along the Desna River. over 200 kilometers north of Kiev. The advance cut through Soviet defensive lines that were oriented to defend against a westward attack, not a strike from the north. German panzer divisions exploited gaps, bypassed strongpoints, and drove deep into the Soviet rear. They moved faster than Soviet commanders could react, faster than orders could flow through the paralyzed command structure, faster than reinforcements could arrive. Radio intercepts gave German commanders real-time intelligence on Soviet movements. Air reconnaissance spotted every concentration of troops and every attempt to form a defensive line. The Luftwaffe provided close air support, smashing Soviet counterattacks before they could develop momentum. Guderian's tanks covered the distance in less than 2 weeks, a rate of advance that seemed impossible given the poor roads, fuel shortages, and mechanical breakdowns that plagued every unit. Simultaneously, Kleist's 1st Panzer Group struck north from the bridgehead at Kremenchug, which Army Group South had seized in a daring crossing of the Dnieper River. Kleist's advance mirrored Guderian's. Rapid penetration, bypass resistance, drive for the objective. The 2 panzer groups were executing a double envelopment across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory, coordinating their movements without direct communication, relying on the operational plan and the initiative of subordinate commanders. It was armored warfare at its most audacious. On September 16th, advance elements of the 3rd Panzer Division from Guderian's force met reconnaissance units from the 16th Panzer Division of Kleist's force at the town of Lokvitsia. The German soldiers shook hands. The trap was closed. Inside the pocket were the Soviet 5th, 21st, 26th, and 37th Armies, along with rear echelon units, supply columns, and civilians caught in the collapse. The total came to approximately 665,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. Guderian wrote in his memoirs, "Never in the history of war has there been a battle of encirclement on such a scale." German soldiers who witnessed the pocket described scenes that defied comprehension, mile after mile of abandoned equipment. Columns of prisoners extending to the horizon, so long that the front of the column reached German collection points, while the rear was still inside the shrinking pocket. Roads jammed with horses, guns, trucks, wagons, and men in utter confusion. Soviet units that attempted to break out were destroyed piecemeal by German forces that held all the advantages of position, firepower, and air superiority. Some Soviet soldiers fought with suicidal determination. Others surrendered in masses, overwhelmed and leaderless. The German war correspondents called it a victory beyond all previous imagination. The numbers confirmed their assessment. By September 26th, when organized resistance ended, the Germans counted their haul. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers captured. At least 100,000 killed in the fighting or during breakout attempts. Only about 10,000 escaped the encirclement. The material losses were staggering. More than 3,000 tanks destroyed or captured. Over 3,700 artillery pieces, hundreds of aircraft caught on the ground or shot down trying to supply the pocket. The Soviet Southwestern Front ceased to exist as a fighting force. To understand the scale, compare Kiev to other famous encirclements. The Minsk pocket in June and July 1941 had netted 300,000 Soviet prisoners. The Smolensk pocket in July yielded another 300,000. The twin battles of Vyazma and Bryansk in October 1941 would trap 600,000, nearly matching Kiev. Even the encirclement of the German 6th Army at Stalingrad in January 1943, one of the most famous battles in history, resulted in only 91,000 Axis prisoners. Kiev dwarfed them all. It was the mother of all encirclements, an operational masterpiece that validated every principle of German armored doctrine. The operational triumph was complete. But as Guderian's exhausted panzers sat amid the wreckage of the Soviet Southwestern Front, the calendar showed early autumn, and Moscow lay 450 kilometers to the north. Had Hitler's gamble paid off, or had Germany just won a battle while losing the war? The Kiev operation consumed 4 to 6 weeks of campaign time, depending on how the calculation is made. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group began its southward movement in late August. The encirclement closed on September 16th. Mopping up operations continued until September 26th. Then the Panzers had to redeploy north again for the assault on Moscow. Operation Typhoon, the code name for the Moscow offensive, did not begin until October 2nd, 1941. That start date pushed the offensive directly into the autumn Rasputitsa, the mud season that turned Russian roads into rivers of sucking clay. The Rasputitsa began in mid-October, exactly as the German spearheads were gaining momentum. Tanks bogged down, trucks sank to their axles. Supply columns that had struggled to keep up in dry weather now ground to a complete halt. Soldiers who had expected to be in Moscow by September now faced the prospect of fighting through October, November, and into the Russian winter without adequate clothing, shelter, or logistics. The delay was not merely a matter of calendar days. It was a question of operational readiness. Guderian's panzer divisions had driven over 200 kilometers south from their positions in front of Smolensk. They had fought a major encirclement battle against an enemy that, though surrounded, continued to resist with desperation. Then they had to drive north again, retracing much of the distance they had covered, to reach their jumping-off positions for Typhoon. The wear on vehicles was immense. Tanks that had covered thousands of kilometers since the invasion began in June were breaking down at accelerating rates. Spare parts were non-existent. Maintenance crews performed miracles of improvisation, cannibalizing disabled vehicles to keep others running. Fuel shortages meant that units sat idle for days waiting for supply trucks that arrived half empty or not at all. The German army that attacked toward Moscow in October was not the same force that had smashed through Soviet defenses in June. It was worn down, understrength, and running on fumes. The weather closed the window permanently. The autumn rains began in mid-October, exactly on schedule, as any Russian peasant could have predicted. The mud stopped the German advance more effectively than any Soviet counterattack. Panzer divisions that had covered 50 kilometers a day in the summer now struggled to advance 5 infantry divisions slogged through knee-deep muck, their boots disintegrating, their energy sapped by cold and exhaustion. The Luftwaffe, which had provided decisive air support throughout the campaign, found its forward airfields turned into swamps, grounding aircraft just when they were needed most. Then came the winter. November brought freezing temperatures that the Germans were unprepared to endure. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and newspapers for insulation. Vehicles refused to start. Weapons froze. Frostbite casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. By early December, German spearheads had reached the outskirts of Moscow. Reconnaissance units reported seeing the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Then the Soviet counteroffensive struck, and the German advance became a retreat. Many historians argue that the delay caused by the Kiev operation cost Germany its last realistic chance to capture Moscow and win the war in the east. The argument is straightforward. If Guderian's panzers had continued their advance from Smolensk in August instead of diverting south, they would have reached Moscow in early September, before the Rasputitsa, before the winter, and before the Soviets could bring up the reserve armies from Siberia that would stop the German offensive in December. Moscow might have fallen. The Soviet government might have evacuated or collapsed. The psychological shock might have triggered the disintegration that Hitler had predicted. Instead, the Germans arrived late, exhausted, and just in time to be stopped by mud, winter, and a revitalized enemy. The operational masterpiece at Kiev had enabled the strategic catastrophe at Moscow. The tactical brilliance had served strategic folly. But the true cost of Kiev would be measured not just in lost weeks and worn-out tanks. In the occupied city itself, another operation was about to begin, one that would reveal what this war was really about. Kiev fell on September 19, 1941, 3 days after the encirclement closed. German forces entered the city to scenes of celebration from some Ukrainian nationalists who viewed the Wehrmacht as liberators from Soviet rule. That illusion lasted exactly 10 days. On September 29th and 30th, SS Brigadeführer Otto Rasch, commander of Einsatzgruppe C, along with Sonderkommando 4A and units of the German 6th Army, organized and executed the murder of 33,771 Jews at a ravine called Babi Yar on the outskirts of the city. The victims were ordered to assemble under the pretense of resettlement. They were marched to the ravine in groups. They were forced to undress. They were shot, and their bodies fell into the ravine. The killing continued for 2 days without pause. The SS documented the massacre in official reports sent to Berlin, recording the number of dead with bureaucratic precision. The Babi Yar massacre was not an accident or an excess. It was policy. The Einsatzgruppen were mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht into occupied territory with the explicit mission of murdering Jews, communists, and other designated enemies of the Reich. Their operations were coordinated with military authorities who provided logistical support, security, and in many cases, active participation. The connection between the Battle of Kiev and the Babi Yar massacre was direct and causal. The encirclement destroyed the Soviet forces defending the city. The fall of the city brought it under German occupation. The occupation enabled the immediate implementation of the final solution. Military conquest and genocidal extermination were not separate events. They were two phases of the same operation. The 600,000 Soviet soldiers captured in the Kiev pocket faced a fate nearly as brutal as the Jews murdered at Babi Yar. German policy towards Soviet prisoners of war was explicitly exterminatory. The OKW and OKH, the German high commands, issued orders that Soviet POWs were to be given minimal rations and no medical care. The policy was part of the Hunger Plan, a deliberate strategy to extract food from occupied Soviet territory by starving the local population, and prisoners' rations for Soviet POWs were set at 700 to 900 calories per day, far below the level needed for survival. The prisoners were held in overcrowded transit camps called dulags, open-air enclosures with no shelter, no sanitation, and no protection from the elements. Disease spread unchecked. Men died of dysentery, typhus, exposure, and simple starvation. Of the 600,000 Soviet soldiers captured at Kiev, fewer than half survived the first winter. Over 60% of all Soviet POWs captured in 1941, including those from Kiev, died by the spring of 1942. The total number of Soviet POWs who died in German captivity during the entire war exceeded 3 million out of 5.7 million captured, a mortality rate of over 50%. By contrast, the mortality rate for Western Allied POWs held by Germany was less than 5%. The difference was not logistical. It was ideological. Nazi racial doctrine classified Slavs as subhuman, unworthy of the protections afforded to prisoners from Western nations. The deliberate starvation of Soviet POWs was genocide by another name, carried out with the same systematic cruelty as the mass shootings in ravines like Babi Yar. The Battle of Kiev was not just the largest encirclement in military history. It was a window into the true nature of the Nazi war in the East, where operational brilliance served exterminatory goals. Military victory enabled mass murder. The fall of Kiev led directly to Babi Yar. The capture of 600,000 prisoners led directly to their deaths in the dulags. The connection was not incidental. It was fundamental. This was not a conventional war of armies and territory. It was a war of extermination, and every operational success advanced that goal. But what does this convergence of military genius and genocidal horror tell us about the war itself? Mikhail Kirponos was 53 years old when he took command of the Soviet Southwestern Front in June 1941. He was a career officer who had survived the purges, a competent commander trusted by Stalin to defend Ukraine. By early September, Kirponos understood that his position was untenable. He could see the German pincers converging. He requested permission to withdraw. He was refused. On September 17th, when Stalin finally authorized retreat, Kirponos attempted to organize a breakout. The effort was hopeless. The encirclement line was already established. German forces held every road and every river crossing. Kirponos gathered his staff and the remnants of his headquarters units and attempted to fight their way east. On September 20th, his column was ambushed by German troops near the village of Shumaikovskoye. Kirponos was killed in the fighting, either by shrapnel or small arms fire. His body was found later by Soviet forces and identified by his uniform and documents. He died trying to execute an order that came too late, a commander who recognized the trap but was forbidden to escape it. Fedor von Bock commanded Army Group Center, the most powerful formation in the Wehrmacht. He was a Prussian aristocrat and professional soldier who had risen through the ranks by competence and loyalty. He advocated for the direct assault on Moscow throughout August 1941, arguing that diverting the Panzers to Kiev would lose the strategic initiative. He was overruled by Hitler. Von Bock's war diary entries from late August and early September record his frustration and his certainty that the decision was a mistake. After the war, in his memoirs and in interviews with historians, von Bock maintained that the Kiev operation, though tactically brilliant, was strategically catastrophic. He believed that Moscow could have been taken in September if the Panzers had not been diverted. He was never able to prove the counterfactual, but his judgment was shared by most of the senior commanders who fought the campaign. Semyon Budyonny was one of Stalin's oldest comrades, a cavalry commander from the Civil War who had been elevated to high command more for political loyalty than for military skill. By 1941, Budyonny understood modern warfare well enough to recognize the encirclement threat at Kiev. He requested permission to withdraw in late August and again in early September. He was overruled, then relieved of command and replaced by Semyon Timoshenko. Budyonny survived the war, unlike many Soviet commanders who failed or retreated without authorization. His survival was likely due to his personal relationship with Stalin, but his reputation never recovered. He became a symbol of the old guard, a man whose instincts were correct, but who lacked the authority or the courage to act on them. The Soviet survivors of the Kiev pocket told stories of chaos and abandonment. One soldier recalled waiting for orders in a village east of Kiev. As German artillery crept closer each day, the orders never came. The chain of command had disintegrated. Officers disappeared or were killed. Soldiers formed small groups and tried to break out on their own. Most were captured or killed. A few made it through the German lines by traveling at night, hiding during the day, and living off the land. Those who escaped described scenes of desperation. Wounded men left behind because they could not keep up. Civilians caught in the collapse, fleeing east with whatever they could carry. German aircraft strafing columns of refugees and soldiers without distinction. The survivors also described the moment of capture. German soldiers rounding up prisoners by the thousands, stripping them of valuables, separating officers from enlisted men, and marching them west toward the gulags. The prisoners knew what awaited them: starvation, disease, death. One survivor said, "We knew we were surrounded, but Stalin's order was clear: hold at all costs. Many tried to break out in small groups, but only a handful escaped." These individual fates, from Hitler's ideological gamble to Kirponos's death in the pocket, to the 33,771 murdered at Babi Yar, were not separate tragedies, but interconnected consequences of the same strategic decisions. What, then, is the final verdict on the Battle of Kiev? The Battle of Kiev was the largest encirclement in military history, trapping 665,000 Soviet soldiers in a pocket that yielded 600,000 prisoners and destroyed an entire front. By any operational measure, it was a triumph. German commanders executed a double envelopment across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory with precision and speed. The victory validated the principles of armored warfare that Guderian and other panzer theorists had developed in the interwar years. It demonstrated that the Wehrmacht, even after 2 months of continuous operations, could still achieve decisive results against a numerically superior enemy. It eliminated the threat to Army Group South's northern flank and opened the road to Ukraine's economic heartland. Hitler's decision to prioritize the destruction of Soviet forces and the capture of resources over the immediate assault on Moscow appeared, in the immediate aftermath, to be vindicated. But the operation was also, potentially, the decision that lost Germany the war. The delay to Operation Typhoon was real and measurable. 4 to 6 weeks elapsed between the start of the Kiev operation and the beginning of the Moscow offensive. Those weeks pushed the attack into the autumn mud season and the Russian winter. German forces that might have reached Moscow in early September instead arrived in late November, exhausted, understrength, and just in time to be stopped by weather and Soviet reserves. Many historians, including David Glantz and John Erickson, argue that this delay cost Germany its last realistic chance to win the war in the East. Without the capture of Moscow, the war became a grinding attrition struggle that Germany could not win against an enemy with vastly superior manpower and industrial capacity. The operational masterpiece enabled the strategic catastrophe. The debate over whether Hitler or his generals were correct remains unresolved. Some historians, notably David Stahel, argue that the logistical and operational constraints facing the Wehrmacht in August 1941 meant that a direct assault on Moscow would likely have failed, regardless of the Kiev diversion. Army Group Center was overstretched, undersupplied, and facing stiffening Soviet resistance at Smolensk. The Panzers needed time to refit. The infantry needed time to catch up. The supply lines needed to be consolidated. In this view, the Kiev operation was a rational choice given the circumstances, and the failure at Moscow was inevitable given the fundamental mismatch between German objectives and German resources. Other historians maintain that the window was open in August, that Moscow could have been taken if the Panzers had continued their advance, and that Hitler's decision to divert them was the fatal mistake. The counterfactual cannot be proven, but the consensus among military historians tilts toward the view that the delay undermined German prospects for quick victory. The direct connection between the military encirclement and the Babi Yar massacre 10 days later reveals that operational assessment cannot be separated from the war's exterminatory nature. The Battle of Kiev was not just a military operation, it was an enabler of genocide. The fall of the city brought it under German occupation. The occupation enabled the implementation of the final solution. The 33,771 Jews murdered at Babi Yar died because the Wehrmacht won the battle. The 600,000 Soviet POWs who died in the gulags died because German policy treated them as subhuman. The operational brilliance served an ideological program of extermination. To assess Kiev purely as a military operation, without acknowledging its role in the Nazi war of annihilation, is to miss the fundamental nature of the conflict. The Battle of Kiev forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Operational brilliance can serve strategic folly. Tactical genius can enable genocide. The largest military victory can contain the seeds of ultimate defeat. What lessons does this convergence hold for understanding the Second World War? The Battle of Kiev demonstrates how Hitler's ideological objectives consistently overrode military logic throughout the war in the East. The decision to prioritize Ukraine's resources and the destruction of Soviet forces over the capture of Moscow was not a purely strategic calculation. It reflected Nazi racial and economic goals. The conquest of Lebensraum, the subjugation of Slavic populations, and the extraction of resources to feed the Reich were foundational to the entire invasion. Hitler's vision was not limited to defeating the Red Army. It encompassed the restructuring of Eastern Europe according to Nazi racial doctrine. That vision shaped operational decisions in ways that professional military officers found irrational. The generals wanted to take Moscow because it was the enemy's capital and the hub of the transportation network. Hitler wanted Ukraine because it fit his ideological program. The clash between military professionalism and ideological fanaticism defined the German war effort and contributed to its ultimate failure. Stalin's command paralysis at Kiev exemplified the systemic weaknesses of the Soviet command structure that would cost millions of lives before reforms enabled eventual victory. The terror that Stalin had instilled in the Red Army through the purges created a culture where initiative was punished and retreat was treason. Commanders waited for explicit orders rather than acting on their own judgment. When the orders were wrong or came too late, entire armies were destroyed. Kiev was not an isolated incident. Similar disasters occurred at Minsk, Smolensk, Vyazma, and Bryansk in 1941. The pattern only changed when Stalin was forced to grant his commanders operational flexibility and when the survivors of the early disasters learned through bitter experience how to fight the Wehrmacht. The eventual Soviet victory was achieved despite Stalin's command style, not because of it. The operation reveals the inseparability of military operations and genocidal occupation on the Eastern Front. The encirclement directly enabled Babi Yar. The capture of prisoners directly enabled their starvation under the Hunger Plan. Military conquest and genocide were not parallel tracks. They were integrated components of a single strategy. The Wehrmacht was not merely fighting a conventional war, while the SS committed atrocities in the rear. The Wehrmacht provided logistical support, security, and in many cases active participation in the mass killings. The generals who executed brilliant encirclements were the same officers who signed orders for the starvation of prisoners and the deportation of civilians. The operational masterpieces enabled the genocidal occupation. To study the military history of the Eastern Front without confronting this reality is to fundamentally misunderstand the war. The Kiev dilemma, whether to prioritize Moscow or Ukraine, encapsulated Germany's fundamental strategic impossibility. The Reich lacked the resources to achieve all objectives simultaneously. Taking Moscow, conquering Ukraine, besieging Leningrad, and securing the Caucasus oil fields required more divisions, more tanks, more fuel, and more time than Germany possessed. The logistical overstretch was evident by August 1941. The supply lines could not keep pace with the advance. The infantry could not catch up to the panzers. The fuel shortages paralyzed entire formations. The mechanical breakdowns multiplied. The Wehrmacht was fighting a war of extermination that guaranteed total Soviet resistance. Yet, it lacked the resources to sustain offensive operations across a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The Kiev operation succeeded tactically, but failed strategically because it consumed resources and time that could not be replaced. The operational brilliance masked the underlying reality that Germany was losing the war of attrition from the moment the invasion began. The Battle of Kiev stands as a monument to a terrible truth. In war, the most brilliant tactical execution can serve the most catastrophic strategic vision. Military history cannot be separated from moral history. In those 16 days in September 1941, we see not just the largest encirclement ever achieved, but a microcosm of the entire Nazi war in the East, operationally masterful, strategically self-defeating, morally monstrous. The Battle of Kiev was the largest encirclement in military history, a tactical masterpiece that became a strategic catastrophe. Hitler's gamble against his general's advice destroyed 665,000 Soviet troops, but cost Germany the 4 to 6 weeks that might have won Moscow. Stalin's fatal refusal to authorize retreat until one day after the trap closed exemplified the command paralysis that would cost millions of Soviet lives before the system reformed, and the direct line from the encirclement to the Babi Yar massacre 10 days later revealed that this operational triumph was inseparable from the Nazi war of extermination. In answering how Kiev can be narrated, we find that it must be told as all three simultaneously: military masterpiece, strategic blunder, genocidal enabler. Only in that convergence do we understand the true nature of the war in the East. The 665,000 men who vanished into the pocket, the 33,771 murdered at Babi Yar, and the German soldiers who won the battle but lost the war, all testify to the same lesson. Brilliance in execution means nothing when it serves a vision built on madness and atrocity. If you enjoyed this story, Hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.